Perhaps we could have on screen your third witness statement, which is WITN 4505389. And could we go, please, to page 11? So if we look at paragraph 2.20, on 25th February 2000, I received an email from Ms. James seeking a progress update. And then if we go to the next paragraph, I replied by email on the same day stating, at the bottom, it says, meanwhile, I'll find out what I can about the destroyed files. So is it right to understand that at least by the 25th of February 2000, you had been informed that the GEB files had been destroyed?
Or some of them. Yes, I think among the recently disclosed documents, there was one from the file, the registered file people to Anne Willans, confirming documents destroyed. I think that was something like the 25th or 26th of February, something like that.
And you deal with it.
Yes. So yes, Anne wrote to the DRO, the register, on the 24th to ask about them, and got an email on the 28th with the list of destroyed files and the dates when they'd been destroyed. And
we don't need to turn the document up, but there should be a reference on the bottom of that document that you're just looking at.
I don't have the document itself.
Right, okay,
it's
that's
just my
notes. Okay, thank you. Dr. Raymond gave evidence to the inquiry that, at least in relation to GEB4, that it had been discovered that had been destroyed in 1994. By the time you were in correspondence with the Records Office, more files had been destroyed, had they?
They had, yes. And there's an email between Dr. Raymond and Anita James in the disclosed documents, which I wasn't aware of at the time, that confirms that earlier destruction.
And I think your witness statement tells us that by the time you were looking into this, JEB 5 to 17 had also been destroyed.
Yes.
And that those JEB files contain minutes and background papers to the ACVSB between May 1989 and February 1992.
Yes.
And just again to be clear, is it right that the actions which led to those JEB files 4 to 17 being destroyed sometime between 1994 and 1999 were nothing to do with you?
That is correct. That's covered in the subsequent audit investigation.
So you can't assist us with understanding why particular dates were put for destruction of those files on the dockets?
No, I mean, they shouldn't have been marked for destruction at all. So the dates are almost irrelevant, but yes, it makes no sense that they were marked for destruction at any stage.
And do you know the name of the person who ordered the destruction of the GEB files 4 to 17?
I do not. As I said in my witness statement, I might have known at the time, but if I did, I've certainly forgotten now.
Now, your witness statement sets out the significant amount of steps that you took to try and find the files. I'm going to come on to talk about what you found out about what happened to them, but I'm focusing now on what steps you took to try and effectively reassemble those files that were missing so that they could be provided as disclosure in the hepatitis C litigation. I think I'm going to do it by running through what I've gleaned from your witness statement. So first of all, you looked at the policy files held by the Health Service Division. Is that right? So your division, effectively.
Yes.
And you found some of the documents from an earlier discovery exercise.
Yes.
And that we see at paragraph 2.9 of your witness statement. Do you know what that discovery exercise was, or what litigation it was in?
I do not.
You checked the files of the Hepatitis C Advisory Group, in particular John Canavan's old papers.
So I started to identify people who might have kept papers, former members or secretariat to the committee. So they were my next sort of set of go-to people, with some success but not complete.
So that was the Hepatitis C Advisory Group.
Yeah.
And then you spoke to Mike McGovern, who had taken over as the secretariat for ACVSB from Dr. Metters. Is that right?
Yes, I think so. I mean, by my time, that committee didn't exist. It was MSBT, but yes, he had. Not taken over from Dr. Metters. No, Mike McGovern took over from Andre Raymond.
Sorry, Andre Raymond. And you. So did you speak to Mike McGovern and see whether he had any papers?
Yes, I would have done. I mean, we were, desks feet apart. So yes, I would have done that. First thing I would have done, I imagine.
You looked in the basement at Eileen House for any records? That's something you did?
Possibly. I will be honest. Apart from one or two, this general sense of frustration, and for example, going to Professor Zuckerman's office at the Royal Free, my memory of this is quite limited, and it's been mostly jogged by seeing the papers from the time.
And you've set that all out in the witness statement?
As well as I can, yes.
As you say, you approached Dr. Zuckerman, you approached Sandra Falconer.
In Scotland, papers. Yes. I approached Scotland, colleagues in Scotland and Wales as well, I think.
And Dr. Perry as well, who was another member of the ACVSB.
Yes, and I think Angela Robinson, who was at that stage medical director of the National Blood Service.
And you also got some papers from Justin Fenwick, or perhaps that was Miss James. I
think Miss James got them following our meeting with him when he gave advice. And
I'm going to come on to that. And there were also some papers were obtained from Dr. Metters' secretary. Was that you, or was that Miss James? Can you recall?
I thought we didn't obtain papers from Dr. Metters' secretary. I thought the dreadful bombshell was that Dr. Metters' secretary had disposed of all Dr. Metters' papers.
I think there's reference to her having found some.
Right.
So despite all of those efforts, is it right to understand that while you found quite a lot of the documents that were missing, there were still some that you weren't able to find?
That's correct.
I'm now going to ask you some questions to elicit what you found out about what happened to those documents that were lost, that were missing. So can I start by going to DHSC 0046972_133? No, that's not the one I want. DHSC 0046972_131. I think I gave you the wrong reference. Yes, I did. So here we've got instructions to counsel to advise addressed to Justin Fenwick QC, and if we go over the page, we can see that counsel is instructed to advise in conference fixed the 3rd of March about the disclosure of documents in relation to hepatitis C. And is it right to understand from your witness statement that you attended that conference with Miss James?
I did.
And then we can see the context. By consent, it was agreed that the Department of Health should disclose on a non-party basis all documents, letters, reports, internal memoranda and other documentation relating to the introduction of surrogate or routine anti-HCV screening generated during the period of 1st March 98 to 1st September 1991, and the minutes of the meetings of the Advisory Committee on Hepatitis. So in broad terms, those were the documents that you were seeking to find in order to disclose in the hepatitis C litigation. Is that right?
Don't recall looking for the Advisory Committee on Hepatitis papers. It may be that Anita James had those already.
So you were looking for the ACVSB papers?
Yes.
And then it's paragraph 5 over the page, please, that I want to draw your attention to. Ms. James, I think, who drafted this, is setting out the facts, and she says this: when DMS, and I understand DMS are the solicitors in the hepatitis C litigation.
Yes.
When they first intimated that they were going to seek disclosure, your instructing solicitor approached Dr. Metters' former secretary, Yvonne de Sampaio, who now works for Dr. Pat Troop, the current Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Public Health. Quite to the incredulity of Mrs. James, Mr. Sampaio told her that she had destroyed the documents because the BSE disclosure process had caused her great difficulty. Dr. Metters' records are therefore not available. And can I just then show you one more document before I come to ask you questions? DHSC, in fact, let's deal with this through your witness statement. If we go back to your witness statement, it's WITN 4505389, and page 18, please. And you set out at paragraph 2.40 on the 8th of March 2000, so 5 days after the conference with counsel, you received an email from Dr. Metters, and it says this: I no longer have any documents relating to HCV. I had, however, retained copies of all the minutes of ACVSB after I became chairman in August 1989, and all MSBT minutes in my personal file when I demitted from my DCMO role on 31st of August. I do not know where these are now, but I had retained them because of the expected HCV litigation. I did not, however, have copies of all the papers considered by ACVSB. So is this right, that by the 8th of March you knew that Dr. Metters had kept papers in anticipation of HCV litigation?
Yes.
And that his secretary had destroyed the papers because she was concerned about the BSE because the BSE disclosure had caused her great difficulties?
Yes, I mean her reasoning for doing that had been communicated to Anita James, not to me, but that came out at the meeting with Justin Fenwick, and yes, it was something of a bombshell. We were incredulous, to say the least.
Would as a secretary, would she have had the authority to destroy Dr. Metters' private papers?
That's a difficult question because these were not papers on a registered file, so they did not fall within the rules on destruction of registered files. However, she clearly understood their importance and destroyed them nonetheless. So I would say that it was entirely wrong of her to have done that.
And presumably she should have cross-checked those papers against the registered files, should she, before destroying them?
If she'd have thought about that, I would guess she didn't think about that.
Did you speak to or interview Mr. Sampaio?
I did not. All the interviews following this were conducted by the internal audit people.
And did you report her actions in destroying those papers to anyone?
I didn't. It was mentioned as an exchange between me and Pat Troop, because Avonda Sampai was working for Pat Troop at the time, so Pat was aware then of what had happened, and there is a response from Pat among the papers.
Yes, so the memo that I found, it may be that there's another one that I've missed, but from you to Pat to Dr. Troop is at DHSC 00046972126. I wonder if this is the one you're
It may be.
thinking of. Yes. So this is your memo to Pat Troop on the 3rd of March 2000. This note is to make you aware of an issue with Marilyn Morgan we'll be raising in a minute to Chris Kelly on Monday. So who are Marilyn Morgan and who's Chris Kelly?
Chris Kelly was the permanent secretary at the time. Marilyn Morgan was the lead solicitor for the department.
And then they set out the background of the hepatitis C litigation at paragraph 2 and the background to the discovery exercise undertaken by the department in paragraph 3. And then in paragraph 4 it says, sole litigation have consulted counsel today on the best way of handling the situation. And then you set out counsel's advice. So we know this memo is after you'd learnt of the actions of Mr. Sampaio. And then if we go over the page, we can see what you tell her about the events. You establish that there are missing documents, and you say sole litigation will need to inform DMS of the situation next week. This will be embarrassing for the department, and DMS could, if they were so minded, make a stink about the destruction of documents vital to their client's case. We think this is unlikely, but Marilyn Morgan will need to appraise the permanent secretary of the situation. I understand that Marilyn Morgan's minute will also refer to the destruction of Dr. Metis's personal papers on ACVSB, which sole litigation took place shortly after his retirement. Although these papers were not on registered files, the implication may be that their destruction was ill-advised. Happy to discuss. So that appears, is that what you were thinking of?
That's what I was thinking of. I assume I deliberately didn't go into detail because that's what Marilyn Morgan was going to do in her note to the permanent secretary.
Do you not think that Dr. Troop should have been informed that her own secretary had apparently deliberately destroyed documents in an attempt, so it seems, to interfere with the disclosure process in anticipated litigation?
What I cannot recall is any conversation that I may have had around this this note. The way I've written it, and so we'll also refer to the destruction, it almost sounds as if it was something that I'd mentioned to Dr. Troop already, but I don't have enough recollection to say if that's the case or not.
Is this a case of trying to present events in the best light to Dr. Troop?
I don't think so, no. And I think, she would have been copied into Marilyn Morgan's note to the permanent secretary and other documents which were far more explicit. So I wasn't trying to sugar the pill in any way.
So, I'll come on to Marilyn Morgan's memo in a moment, but the response from Dr. Troop, I don't think we need to go to it, but it's at WITN 5426214, and you set it out at paragraph 2.39 of your witness statement, and she emails you on the 7th of March saying, "Thank you for alerting me to this. As you say, they were Dr. Metis's private papers, so there should not really be an issue." Is that what you were thinking of?
That's what I was thinking of.
So, perhaps we could go then to the Marilyn Morgan's memo to the permanent secretary. That's at WIT.
Just pause there for a moment. A moment or two ago, you suggested that there was a reason for the destruction of the papers, which in part was to avoid them being disclosed in litigation. If that is so, then did Dr. Troop not understand that this was being suggested? Because she says, as they were Dr. Mehta's private papers, there should not really be an issue. There were papers produced by Dr. Mehta's, after all, Deputy CMO, and they were relevant to the issue, might be relevant, but one doesn't know without seeing them, but suppose they're relevant to the litigation. It's a curiosity, isn't it?
It is. And I'm sorry that my memory of these events is so poor that I can't put any more, do any more than my best interpretation of what's there in the papers.
Well, you didn't do the destruction, but somebody needs to, at least there needs to be a satisfactory explanation for them.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
So if we look at WITN 695 5032. So here we've got what looks like a typed memo from Marilyn Morgan dated 8th March 2000, and it's got a sticky over it with some handwritten notes on it. And we've got, I haven't noted down the other, we've got a copy of this memo without the sticky on it, and it's clear that it's to the Permanent Secretary.
Yes.
But I haven't got the reference to hand.
And the note will be from the Permanent Secretary's private secretary.
Right, so if we look first at what is said by Marilyn Morgan and then look at the handwriting, I think that's probably the most sensible way to deal with it. So issue, a potential problem in relation to the disclosure of documents in the hepatitis C litigation, recommendation that the department sets up a small internal investigation to determine what happened in this case and to make representations to prevent such a thing happening again. And then she sets out the background, first of all, to the hepatitis C litigation, explaining that there's two claims. One is claims brought against the department, which has been stayed, and the second claim is a claim in which the department is not involved and in which the department was being asked for disclosure on a non-party basis, and that was where you had become involved looking for those documents.
Yes.
And then if we go over the page, we can see that she sets out some information about the disclosure process and what the department had been advised by Justin Fenwick in paragraph 2, and Dr. Raymond's involvement in extracting documents kept by the department. And then at paragraph 3, Anita James's involvement taking over the case in June 1999, and she telephoned Dr. Mettis's former secretary to ask for Dr. Mettis's personal papers on the subject, which she had seen when she was previously in sole litigation. Dr. Mettis had been chairman of the advisory committee on the virological safety of blood, which had looked into the adequacy of the tests and given final advice on their introduction in 1991. It transpired that his former secretary had had a clear out when Dr. Mettis retired and that the copy papers no longer existed. And then it sets out the steps, or some of the steps, that you had taken to try and retrieve the registered files and so on. And then it sets out counsel's advice about the disclosure process. So just pausing there, it doesn't look like Marilyn Morgan told the Permanent Secretary the information that you'd received from Mr. Sampaio either.
I think, I mean, firstly, the information about Mr. Sampaio's motives for disposing of the documents came from Anita James. I don't think I heard that directly. And no, she doesn't. I mean, that may well be because the earlier discussion about having an audit to look into this and learn lessons from it made clear that it wasn't going to be a witch hunt. So it may well be that she deliberately chose not to seem to put the blame on one individual.
So, picking up on that point then, if we can look at what council says on over the page, please, at paragraph 7. So this is under the heading Council's Advice. So the council has given some advice about duty to the court not to destroy documents and so on because the department's in stayed litigation. And then at paragraph 7, in addition, council was of the view that there should be a small and probably in-house investigation into the destruction of the documents. The investigator should interview Dr. Metters and his secretary, the person at DH who signed the destruction authorisation, whom we know to still be at DH, and Dr. Raymond. This should not be a witch hunt, but the investigator should report and make recommendations about such matters in the future. Council was of the view that as part of the investigation, Hayward stores should be visited. In this way, the department would have audited what has happened. It occurs to me that this is a function which could properly be carried out by internal audit. Just pausing there, can you recall what council's why council took the view that it shouldn't be a witch hunt?
I can't. I'm afraid, entirely reliant on the record that we have here. My supposition would be that because the people involved in the destruction were very junior, that council felt that it would be better to use this as an opportunity to learn lessons and improve procedures rather than seek to single out very junior individuals.
And then we've got some handwriting there, interviews, Dr. Metters, Secretary, Destructor and Dr. Raymond establish what happened, what should have happened. Does that say department guidance
I think.
And recommendations? Do you know whose writing that is?
I do not.
Is it yours?
No.
And then if we go back over to the front, the first page, sorry. Try and read the writing, the handwritten writing there. It's very unclear at the top, but it seems to say David Clark, Flora Goldhill.
Yes, I think that's right.
Permanent Secretary thinks it sounds as if we ought to take the advice to have a quick investigation. He'd be grateful if you could let him know if you're content with this or have alternative suggestions. If you are content, he'd be grateful if David Clark could set it in
hand,
thank you, with his internal audit team. Many thanks. So is it right to understand then that the decision about the internal audit was made on the advice of council by the Permanent Secretary in consultation with David Clark and Flora Goldhill?
Yes, on the advice of Marilyn Morgan.
And were you involved in the decision about the form that the internal investigation audit should take?
No.
Can we look then at the in-house investigation report, NHBT 40193_137? So we can see that this is dated April 2000, and if we turn please to page 3, we can see the audit scope and coverage of the report at section 2. Broadly, internal audit were asked to establish what happened, identify the extent to which procedures have not been followed, and make recommendations to prevent such incidents from occurring again. Internal audit has not sought to apportion any blame. The purpose of the review is to help prevent such things from happening again. And is it your understanding that the reason why they took the view they did at 2.4 was because that's what they were asked to do? They were asked not to apportion blame?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Do you understand why that approach was taken? Not to apportion blame. I think you said it was because the people involved were junior. Is that?
That was my supposition, that because the people involved were junior, and the fault, if it, probably lay with more senior people who should have supervised what they were doing. And I think Marilyn Morgan had made the point earlier on, I think, that she had not been aware of anything like this happening previously in other disclosures. So this was something that was unfortunately, possibly a one-off, so that what we needed to do was to improve the guidance to ensure this didn't happen again. So it was an exercise in learning lessons and improving procedure, which seemed to be more beneficial than simply pointing the finger at individuals.
Would you accept that stopping the investigation at what happened and not going on to look at who took the actions and why they took the actions that they did to destroy documents, or is a lost opportunity to learn lessons? You don't really get to the root of or understand why documents were destroyed.
I think that's a fair point.
Do you, and you may not be able to answer this, given the evidence you've already given us, but do you understand why this internal audit only looked at the destruction of the GEB files 4 to 17, i.e. the registered files, and didn't consider the destruction of Dr. Metis's private papers by Mr. Sampaio?
Again, I don't, because I had no involvement in the setting of the remit for this. Again, I can only suppose that they were focusing on the process for managing registered files, which, as I explained before, should contain all the records of departmental decision-making. So any papers held privately by individuals should have been duplicated on those files.
So is it right to understand then that in relation to the actions of Mr. Sampaio, that the Cabinet Secretary doesn't appear to have been made aware, at least from that memo that we looked at, of the actions that she took. Dr. Troop, at least from the memo that we looked at, may not have been made aware, although I'm conscious that you said that you may have spoken to her about the actions of Mr. Sampaio. And there's been no investigation by this internal audit into her actions.
Yeah, I can't add anything more, I'm afraid.
Do you know whether or not Dr. Metis and Ms. Sampaio were interviewed as part of this audit process?
I do not.
Do you know whether the person who signed the document destruction docket on the GEB files was interviewed?
I do not. It was evidently the intention that that person should be, but I cannot say for sure if they were.
And lastly, do you know whether Hayward stores were investigated, and do you know what Hayward stores are?
That's the file registry unit. So these are the people who are responsible for receiving registered files and acting on the instructions of officials on reviewing them periodically and destroying them, if that's what the instruction is.
So those are the questions that I have for Mr. Lister.
Yes.
I will need an opportunity to see if there are any further questions from core participants and their legal representatives that they would wish me to put to him.
Do you have any sense of how long you might need?
I think I'll probably need half an hour.
Very well. As you know, this is an opportunity for core participants to put further questions to you through council, and we have to give them time to do that. So we'll meet again not before 4:45. Not before 4:45.